two questions on that. Is we find that Moshe Rabbeinu's tochacha is lama siniun, it's lev bnei Yisrael. Why are you making them afraid again? So my first question would be, why wouldn't Moshe Rabbeinu give them tochacha for not wanting themselves to be in Eretz Yisrael? And why is it only a tochacha about what they're causing? Question number two is does their nachala have any kedusha bichlal? And the third question is where at the end when Moshe Rabbeinu agrees to them, suddenly this shevet Menashe pops up in nowhere. Where do they come from?
Yeah, so those are three good questions. We read, just to repeat for the camera, we read in Parshas Mattos about the two tribes, Reuven and Gad, who say they have a lot of flocks and they have a lot of animals, and east of the Yarden, which was the land of Sichon, the king of Amori, is very, very fertile, so they ask permission if they could settle in the land that the Jewish people just conquered in the lifetime of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, we do know, just to take your questions in reverse order, that Lamaisa, the tribes that settled east of the Jordan River, east of the Yarden, are Reuven, Gad, and half of the tribe of Menashe. Half of it was on the west bank, Eretz Yisrael proper. Half of it was on the east bank. Where do they pop in, so to speak? They weren't the ones who complained. They weren't even the ones who apparently asked for it. So why do they join with Reuven and Gad? That's one question. The other question is the nature of the musar, the nature of the tochacha that Moshe gives. Moshe does not condemn them for not wanting Eretz Yisrael. Moshe does not condemn them for not wanting to cross. Everything about Moshe Rabbeinu's argument is simply that they're going to have a bad effect on the Jewish people, the rest of the Jewish people, and they should participate in the fight. And the third question, which is actually the easiest question, is what is the status in terms of kedusha of Eivor Liyardin? We know Eretz Yisrael has special mitzvos, Truma, Meiser, Shemitah, all of these different halachos. Chutz La'aretz does not have them. What is the status? That's a general halachic question. What is the status of Eivor Liyardin legabe the mitzvos tuluyos ba'oretz? By the way, that potentially might be an interesting question even today, because a lot of Jordan, a lot of modern-day Jordan, and part of Syria even, would be nichlal in the lands of the 2.5 tribes, and the question becomes, next time you're in Syria and you buy something with a hechsher, do you have to take off trumas and maasros, or without a hechsher, I should say, you buy an apple. Okay, so legabe Eivor Liyardin, Lamaisa, that is a machlekes. It is a machlekes in halacha. If Eivor Liyardin has kedusha sa'aretz, some say doraisa it does, because it was conquered by Al Pi Hashem. Hashem commanded the area to be conquered, so that would give it kedusha sa'aretz. Others say it would be a chiyuv d'Rabbanan, but it certainly does have a chiyuv. However, then you get into, it's a complicated question, would that apply today? Some say it wouldn't apply today, right? So that's a separate machlokus within that. In terms of Chatzi Shevet Menashe, it is very true that we really don't know the story. See, the one thing we know about Chatzi Shevet Menashe is that the Torah does tell us that in addition to the land of Sichon and Og, which was conquered by the Jewish people, it does say that the tribe of Menashe conquered the area around the Golan today. So it's interesting that their claim to it was they actually conquered it. They actually conquered it. Now, why the Torah doesn't mention them in the story is a good question. I don't have a good teretz for that. But how they appeared on the scene, it's because they actually conquered that territory themselves. And maybe, just maybe there's less of a taina on them because they're claiming land that they conquered, as opposed to Reuven and Gad, who are so-called piggybacking, excuse the lashon, on top of what the Jewish people as a whole conquered. Right, so maybe there's a difference there. Now, in terms of the musar, why is the emphasis so much on the negative effect on other people? This is very common because, if I'm mochiach you because, you didn't, you did a certain avera, so you might say, okay, if I want to go to hell, I'll go to hell. Don't bother me. So sometimes the most effective tochacha is, okay, you can do what you want, but look at the effect that you're having on other people. That's a very common way that we are Mochiach people, that we basically say, you may not care about yourself, but care about other people. So, so it makes sense in a sense that would be the direction of Moshe Rabbeinu's teichacha. Yeah?
Could the Rav maybe illuminate for us the reason, or some reasons why the terms Mattos and Shvatim both mean tribes and staffs?
Yeah. A very, very interesting question. We have two words for tribes, mateh and shevet, and indeed, those are both words of staff. So there are two questions here. One question is easier than the other. What is the connection between staff and tribe? Whether it's shevet or whether it's mateh, that I think is not that difficult to answer, because we do find that a shevet is a scepter, and it's always used as a symbol of authority. When Yaakov says, lo yasur shevet, there he uses shevet, lo yasur, Yaakov Avinu's bracha, lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda, the scepter, the staff, the scepter of authority shall not pass away from the tribe of Yehuda. So since the head of a shevet was technically almost the melech, almost the king of the tribe, so that was symbolized by a staff of authority, a scepter of authority. Now, the first question is actually a more difficult question. That is, okay, I understand the connection between tribe and staff, because the leadership of the tribe was symbolized by a staff, but what is the difference between mateh and shevet? Now it is interesting that Moshe Rabbeinu's staff, with which he did many, many miracles, is always referred to as a mateh. It is never referred to as a shevet. On the other hand, when Yaakov Avinu is referring to monarchy, that Yehuda will be the tribe of monarchy, Yaakov Bedavka uses the word shevet. So I'm trying to remember now. One second. I might be wrong. In the Torah, does the Torah use the word shevet for tribes? I'm going on thin ice here. My memory may not be great, but I believe at least in the majority of cases, the lashon that the Torah uses for shvatim is always matos. L'mateh Reuven, when it talks about the number of each tribe, l'mateh. So it could be, perhaps, that mateh is kind of more of a divine connotation, meaning shevet may refer to what we might call political authority, and mateh may have more of a spiritual connotation of divine authority. And since in the Midbar there was such an open revelation of divinity, the man, the be'er, so essentially it was kind of God ruling over them directly without really human intermediaries. So perhaps in that hanhaga, we refer to the mateh, like Moshe's mateh. In later times, we talk about more of a shevet. And since Yaakov's bracha was about the future, when there wouldn't be these divine miracles so much, so Yaakov refers to the authority as shevet. But it's a good ha'ara. I'm going to check. Now, if you want to, let me give you a very interesting sefer that almost always addresses it, meaning this would be the go-to book to see the difference between mateh and shevet. One of the great commentaries of the 19th century on Chumash is a sefer that's not used very much today, unfortunately. It's a big loss. It's called Haksava HaKabbalah. In fact, I often say that the Reform movement has a big zechus in Shemayim. Reform movement comes up and the Midas Hadin says, look at all the bad things that you did, etc. You say, what do you mean? We gave Klal Yisrael Rav Hirsch, we gave Rav Klal Yisrael the Malbim, we gave Klal Yisrael Haksava Kabbalah. Without us, these books wouldn't have been written at all. And that's actually true. Rav Hirsch wrote his commentary in German to combat the Reform movement by showing the truth of Torah and the integration of the oral law and the written law. The Malbim did the very same thing, and Ksava Kabbalah. These are three books that are essentially trying to integrate the oral law with the written Torah. Because one of the early claims of the Reform movement was that rabbinic interpretation of the Torah is fake, it's forced, it doesn't obey the rules of grammar, it doesn't fit the context of the verse, it's a superimposed, made-up, artificial interpretation. So the Malbim, Rav Hirsch, and Haksava Kabbalah in different ways want to show that the drashas of Chazal are not just made up things, and they're not even just Masorah. They actually fit the deep grammatical structures of the Hebrew language, meaning they are actually pshat. They actually are the pshat of the psukim if you truly understand them. And therefore, it's not an artificial thing. So one of the greatest of these forms is Aksava Kabbalah. Kabbalah does not mean mysticism. It means Masorah, tradition, and the like, Torah Shebal Peh. And this was written by Rav Yaakov Tzvi, the Rav of Mecklenburg in Germany. He was a Talmud of Rabbi Kiva Eger. And the big thing that Aksava Kabbalah does is he's very, very meticulous in nuances of language. So he's into synonym differences. He's into grammatical structures. Sometimes it's very complicated. You have to know dikduk very, very, very well to even understand what he's talking about. They've never translated it in English, but they have put out newer editions with commentaries because he refers to so many obscure writers. He refers, and he has abbreviations. You wouldn't know in a million years, like, who on earth he's referring to. So, Baruch Hashem, there were mefaneach, the Rashi Tevis of all the different rabbis. In other words, he doesn't just refer to famous people. He refers to people that no one ever heard of, basically, but famous grammarians and the like. So this is the go-to book I would go to, and I'll try to check mateh and shevet for sure. He would address it, but it's a very good question. Yeah.
Here's the send-in. If Moshiach comes during these 3 weeks, what haftaros would we read?
Very good question. Yeah, that's the main thing we're going to worry about, right? This is coming from a gabbai mentality. What do we do? Yeah. So first of all, it's entirely possible that we would read special haftaros in honor of Moshiach. I'm not sure what it would be, but again, after Tisha B'Av, we have 7 haftaros of comfort. But rest assured that from Sefer Yeshayahu, you can get more than 7 haftaros of comfort. So somehow we're going to have to reach into the book of Yeshayahu and pick other haftaros of comfort. In other words, I agree with the premise of the question that it is not likely that we're going to read the haftaros of Paranias and tragedy if Be'ezras Hashem Moshiach comes. Now, who's going to decide? Because again, there are many candidates. It's not like there's a shortage. There's many candidates of beautiful haftaros of comfort. So who's going to decide? I don't know. I mean, the Rabbanut will certainly make a decision, but nobody's going to listen to them. So the Rabbanut will say something, and the Charedim are not going to listen to the Rabbanut. So I don't know. But the good news is, well, of course, Moshiach might decide. Actually, now that I think about it, so we may have a definitive decision there. But the good news is that which haftarah you read is not ma'akev. If you learn the Gemara, you see that b'derech klal there is no hakpada that there be a specific chapter as long as it fits the theme of the occasion. Although I'm wondering now that we're talking about this, there is another approach because the emes is like this. The emes is normally a haftarah has to be connected to the Parshas HaShavua. That is a halacha. The exception is, or one of the exceptions is, the 3 haftaros of tragedy before Tisha B'Av, and the 7 haftaros of comfort after Tisha B'Av. So one possibility might be, if the 3 haftaros of tragedy would get canceled because of Moshiach, since we don't have any takanas chachamim about 10 haftaros of comfort, the possibility might be that we would revert back to the general rule that you have to find a haftarah that's connected to Parshas HaShavua. So for the first time, we're going to have to find a haftarah for Parshas V'yeschanan, a haftarah for Parshas Eikev. I'm sorry, not for that. Those are Shivas and Nechemta, but a haftarah for Matos Masai, a haftarah for Devarim, and the like. So those are 2 possibilities. In other words, essentially, what I'm saying, I don't know who's going to decide this, but the question will either be whether we will extend the comfort haftaros or we will revert back to the Parshas HaShavua haftaros, right? Those are the 2 possibilities that we would have, yeah.
What are the mechanics of the law of tofel
And how is that law applied to foods like ice cream in a cone, or chicken soup with grains and vegetables in it, or schnitzel?
You mean, yeah, so the question of birchas hananin, the bracha that you make on food. So we have very complicated rules regarding ikar and tofel when you have different mixtures, and one is considered the predominant, one is considered the more important one, and one is considered the secondary one. So the general rule is simple. Hard to apply, that instead of making two brachos on both foods or the different types of foods, you make a bracha on the ikar, the main one, and that will cover the secondary one. And that's true, remember, not only for the before bracha, it's also true for the after bracha. Right? The after bracha of the ikar is going to cover the tofel. So the question becomes, again, I'm not sure I could really address this in full. One can write a book, and there are whole svarim on this. What defines something as ikar, what defines something as tofel? Well, the problem is there are many, many different criteria. One criteria is majority, in other words, amount that's present, meaning to say when there is a majority of something, that may become the ikar, but sometimes that's not always true. Even if something is a majority, if you really want the other thing, and the majority there is just to give a flavor or whatever it would be, so then that becomes the tofel. And then there are differences between things that are recognizable and things that are totally mixed in. Now with soup, you have an additional problem. With a vegetable soup, so again, soup as a liquid is shahakol. Vegetables are adama. Now the problem with soup is a different problem. Even if in terms of ikar and tofel, the soup is an ikar and the vegetables are a tofel, you may still have to make ha'adama on the soup because broth in which vegetables were cooked, the bracha on the soup itself is going to be adama. So that's a separate issue. In other words, that's not connected to ikar and tofel. Ikar and tofel would be shahakol soup and vegetables adama. But if the soup itself is adama, so you're not going to have the problem of ikar and tofel. So you really have to learn this. The laws of brachos get much more complicated. If you look, we have at least three separate svarim on hilchos brachos. There's Rabbi Bodner's sefer, which is in English with Hebrew footnotes, and then there's Rav Mandelbaum's sefer in Hebrew, and then Art Scroll doesn't have a complete one, but Rav Binyamin first wrote a sefer on the laws of brachos. So you go through the ikar and tofel, you'll see it's a very, very complicated issue. Sometimes it's kedai not to eat. Because there's so many svegas, or to only eat if you're making hamotzi. Yes, sushi is a very big problem. And what?
Cholent would also be a problem.
A cholent? No. Okay. So it depends what's in the cholent. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned this. With ikar and tofel, there's one big exception to ikar and tofel, and that is when you have mizonos mixed in. So when you have mizonos mixed in, even if mizonos is a minority, it has the chashivas of ikar. Now that'll be very relevant with cholent, if cholent, even if you're not eating it in a bread meal, if cholent has barley. By pearl barley we hold is a mizonos. Now, even the rule that mizonos is called ikar, legabe everything else, that's not always true either. Because let's take the bracha on schnitzel. Schnitzel is a real big problem, right? Schnitzel is chicken that has breading on it, right? Now, the chayre, if I apply the rule that mizonos is ikar and everything else is tofel, that should mean we make a mizonos on schnitzel rather than a shahakol. And yet, the minog is legamri that everybody makes a shahakol on schnitzel. And it's brought down because there, you're not really enjoying the mizonos as mizonos. It's just to flavor the chicken. But einochinami, if there's a very thick, whatever that would mean, it's hard to even know what that means, a very thick breading, a very thick coating, at some point we would go back to mizonos. So it is complicated. Schnitzel is kind of similar to chocolate. Remember I mentioned the other day that chocolate, which is made from the cocoa bean, logically should be ha'etz, in terms of the normal idea, because that's how you make the fruit. You make the fruit into cocoa powder and chocolate, and yet the minhag ha'olam is we make a shahakol. So schnitzel is a very similar problem in the sense that schnitzel logically should be a mazonos. The minhag is shahakol. So sometimes you find that the minhagei Yisrael kind of are a little inconsistent with the klalim that we have for brachas. But I think Rabbi Bodner's book is probably the most complete treatment of ikar and tofel. Yeah. Yeah. So sushi, so once again, sushi, it kind of depends. Well, when you say shakal, because of what? Because of the fish? Because of
the fish of the ikar? Or because mazonos, you said it would be mazonos.
Okay. So let me clarify that. Sushi does have a mazonos ingredient, but the mazonos ingredient in sushi is rice. So let me clarify that. The rule of the Gemara, it's an important statement. The rule of the Gemara that mezainis always becomes ikar and the other things become tofel only applies to mezonos over the 5 species of grain. But the mezonos over rice does not have that chashivas, and therefore you'd have to apply the normal rules of ikar and tofel that might be based on majority, or it might be based on what you call the ikar. Now, some people say that the way to resolve all of these questions is just pull out each ingredient separately and make a separate bracha. So pull out the vegetable, make adama, pull out the rice, make mezonos. Although that makes sense, but the truth is the poskim say it's better not to do that. It's better not to cause extra brachos to be made, and it's better to try to get a psak. What is ikar and what is tofel?
In times of Moshiach, if every Torah machlokes will be revealed and resolved with the parsha, whether it's brachos, what would be the need to study Torah if everything's revealed, and will there be any more chiddushim if all Torah is revealed in times of Moshiach?
Yeah, that's a very excellent question. The question becomes, although you're making an assumption, and I'm not sure that assumption is true, you're making an assumption that when Moshiach comes and we have a Sanhedrin, so all halachic questions will be resolved, they will be solved. There will be no makayim for machlokes anymore. If that is the case, and we will have bottom line, definitive answers and determinations, what will be the purpose of learning Torah, other than knowing a practical halacha? We'd have to know that. But why would I have to go through Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, Rashi, Tosfos, Rambam, Ramban, right? Sos, Rebbe Kiva Eger. I mean, we'll have the answer is this. The answer is this. The answer is this. Is there any particular purpose in limud haTorah? Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. So I would say 2 things about that. First of all, it is not so pashut that every single machlokas will be resolved. Remember, when Mashiach comes, what we gain is we gain a Sanhedrin. Actually, going back to an earlier question, and they're going to decide which haftarah we read. So actually, we do have somebody that's going to give you a psak on this. Now, even when there was a Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin had the power to resolve every machlokas. But they didn't always do that. In other words, because you find there were machlokim of Tanoim at a time when there was a Sanhedrin. Well, why didn't they vote? And once they vote, there's no longer a machlokas. The answer is that there were times that the Sanhedrin felt that different shitas ought to exist in Klal Yisrael, that we ought to let different Talmidim follow Beis Shammai, follow Beis Hillel, and the like, that the halacha could develop in different ways, different kivunim. So it's shaykh, theoretically, that even after Mashiach comes and we have a Sanhedrin, there may be certain areas where the Sanhedrin will say, let different people argue. We don't feel the need to definitively resolve. Again, lahavdil, this is totally lahavdil. Sometimes the United States Supreme Court, again, lahavdil, will turn down certain cases by letting the lower courts fight it out and have their different opinions. But the other thing I think is maybe even a more true answer, and that is, let's see, you're assuming in the question, and it's a logical assumption, that the purpose of learning is to kind of know what the final answer is by going through a process. So the kasha is, well, if I know what the final answer is, why bother going through the process? Right? That's the assumption of the question. And the short answer is that going through the process is intrinsically valuable even though you know the answer at the end, even if I know the answer already. Because this way I'm wrapping my mind, in the language of the Baal Tanya, I'm wrapping my head around the Torah, and the Torah is wrapping itself around me. And I become united with HaKadosh Baruch Hu as I immerse myself in trying to understand His Ratzon. So, understanding His Ratzon is not the same as having an answer. I can have an answer to a question. Right? You ask a shaila, am I allowed to do this? So the rabbi says yes, or the rabbi says no. You have an answer, but do you really understand it? Are you connected to that answer? Are you davuk in that emes? Is it wrapped around your brain? Is your brain wrapped around it? And that's the whole union of the devekis to Hashem through the Torah. That we're still going to have, you see? And indeed, this is what the Nefesh HaChaim writes. Nefesh HaChaim writes, this is the paradox, that although the ultimate goal of learning is that we should know what the halacha is, but it's the process itself that connects us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I mean, listen, now with the development of AI, assuming you're allowed to use it, there were Rabbanim in Lakewood that said you're not allowed to use it. So what's going to be? Every time you have a shaila, hey, what am I allowed to do? So AI will paskin for you. Not really, but okay, AI will give you some psak. But that's not maspik. You have to bring the Torah into your neshama. It can't just be in the computer. It has to be inside of us. And that still requires yigiyah b'Torah. Yeah.
Why does Tisha B'Av have a different status than other fast days, in the sense that we don't say tachanun, slichos, or Avinu Malkeinu? Why is that?
Yeah, so Tisha B'Av is a very, very interesting thing. It is, of course, we call it the saddest day of the year. We call it, other than Yom Kippur, it's the most chomer of the fast days and the like. And yet there are some peculiarities of Tisha B'Av that move in the opposite direction. We don't recite tachanun on Tisha B'Av, and we don't say do not say Avinu Malkeinu on Tisha B'Av. And that's because when Yirmiyahu Hanavi in Eicha describes the fast of the day of Av, he calls it a moed. Now moed means an appointed time, but it's also a word for Yom Tov. Tisha B'Av is a Yom Tov. And because it's a Yom Tov, we don't say tachanun. What type of Yom Tov is Tisha B'Av? Tisha B'Av is a Yom Tov? What does that mean? The answer is, yeah, because it says Moshiach is born on Tisha B'Av. What does it mean, Moshiach is born on Tisha B'Av? Are we talking about a birthday? Obviously, Chabad does not believe Moshiach is born on Tisha B'Av. Can't be. The Rebbe's birthday was, Yud Aleph Nisan or whatever it was. But the truth is, they have a teretz, because their teretz is Al Pi the Maharal, who is the Alter Rebbe's great-great-grandfather. They have a yishuv. The Maharal explains that Moshiach being born on Tisha B'Av doesn't mean the birthday of this person is the 9th of Av. But it means the koach that will bring redemption into the world is the magnitude of our mourning and our yearning on Tisha B'Av. Meaning we yearn, we want to connect to Hashem. We have a longing, and that brings Moshiach into the world. So it turns out that from the Avelus itself, that will be the source of the Simcha. And that's really the Lekach. The Lekach is that this is the day that you mourn, this is the day that you grieve, this is the day that you cry. But because of your mourning and because of your grieving and because of your crying, you're bringing Moshiach into the world. And therefore it's a Yom Tov. In fact, there's a beautiful minhag that Yerushalayim, it's an old Yerushalmi minhag, I'm not sure how many people keep it, but old Yerushalmis keep it. That in the afternoon of Tisha B'Av, after Mincha, so the women clean their house, they sweep their floors in honor of the coming of Mashiach. In honor of the coming of Mashiach. On Tisha B'Av itself, we say, this is the day of Mashiach. So Kara Alai Moed is a very, very important idea. And in a more general way, it reminds a Jew not to be broken, not to be despondent, not to give up. We've been so many Tisha B'Avs, so many years, so many things have happened after the Churban Beis HaMikdash. whether it's the Crusades and pogroms and the Holocaust. And this reminds a person not to give up hope. In fact, I read a story. It's actually it's such a cute story. It was written by a frum guy, but he was a member of the German community that went to university, etc. And so he mentions how he was so embarrassed. He says he had a Jewish roommate, and they were fasting on the 9th of Av. But it was a long day. It was boring. They didn't know what to do, so they were playing chess the afternoon of Tisha B'Av. Just playing chess, passing the time. So all of a sudden, there's a knock on their dormitory room, and they couldn't believe it. It was their old Protestant professor, a guy, very religious Christian, who was very, very solemn. And he said, "I've come on your day of mourning to wish you blessings and comfort, and may God restore the temple." So they felt so embarrassed, because here you have this guy who really feels Tisha B'Av, the mourning and the Avelis, and he came over to be Menachem them, where they were just playing chess because it was a long day. but they said this was Chasidei Umas Ha'olam. We're also Margish, Margish the Tsar of the Churban. Yeah.
Oftentimes in halacha, there's a difference between called halachas that when we read, we have to follow this, and there's something that I've been told is called hadracha, that we don't have to follow it, but it's something that it's nice we should do, but if we don't do it, it's not like we're violating any halachic injunctions. How do we tell the difference when we're reading, let's say, something like Aruch HaShulchan or Kitzur Shulchan Aruch or Mishnah Berurah, the difference between halacha and hadracha?
Yeah, so again, that's a very, very excellent question. Halacha, as you pointed out, Sifrei Halacha have many, many different hierarchies of rules. Sometimes you're obligated to do something, and sometimes it's usher to do something. That's maybe the highest hierarchy. You're chayav to do this, it's usher to do this, right? That's the basic. But then we have things, lechatchila, it's better to do this, but if you didn't do that, you can do it this way. That's a little less. Other times the halacha is even lechatchila, you don't have to do it, but if you're at baal nefesh or yarei shemayim, you'll try to be more conscientious. Or sometimes it'll just say, it is a good thing to do, meaning if I don't do it, I'm still okay, but I'm not doing a good thing. Well, in terms of the immediate question, how do you know? Basically, the language, there are cues in the language itself. Now, you have to be attuned to it a little bit. It may not always be immediately intuitive, but, the language will often indicate, or it should indicate, Doraisa, Drabanan, Minhag, Lechatchila, B'di'eved, Baal Nefesh. Baal Nefesh means a righteous, God-fearing person, etc. And you follow the cues. Now, the more difficult question, though, is, let's assume I've sorted out the cues. How do I know what applies to me? In other words, obviously, if something is obligatory or something is prohibited, that applies to everybody. But what about things like a baal nefesh, a person with a conscientious soul, or a God-fearing person should do something? Well, what am I supposed to do? Am I a God-fearing person? Am I a baal nefesh? What am I exactly? So here, you do have to be careful, because although I hope everybody in the room, wants to be a Yirei Shemayim, of course, but the point is, certain levels are not always good for people at different stages in their lives. This is the whole phenomenon of being machmir. Is it good to be machmir? Well, generically, I could say, yeah, it's good to be machmir. Why not? But the problem is, as Rav Dessler points out, being machmir beyond the halacha has costs that can penetrate other areas of your life. So, for example, being machmir beyond the halacha may create anxiety, and anxiety may create anger and bitterness, and you may lash out at your wife. In other words, every time you take on a certain practice, there will be some ripple effects that may cause you to neglect things that you're obligated to do, and cause you to be over on things you're not allowed to be over on. So a person has to check their spiritual energy levels and the ripple effects. Generally speaking, anything beyond the halacha that causes anxiety should not be undertaken, meaning something should be done b'simcha. Now again, when it comes to actual halacha, we do have less flexibility, although even then, there are difficult questions that we could address. So I couldn't tell a person, generally, oh gee, if you're so nervous on Shabbos because you're not smoking, go ahead and take some cigarettes. That usually we wouldn't be allowed to tell somebody. But if you're talking about a chumrah that goes beyond the halacha, we can tell a person, this is not for you to take on at this point because it may have some very, very difficult effects. So you have to be careful. And this is the meaning of the pasuk in Koheles. Al titzdak harbe. Do not be too much of a tzaddik. Pasuk Shlomo HaMelech said, do not be too much of a tzaddik. What's wrong with being too much of a tzaddik? Halvai. We should be more and more of a tzaddik. The answer is because sometimes being too much of a tzaddik may have costs that you're not ready to assume and may be very hurtful in other areas. And sometimes it's the Yetzer Hara. An example would be, let's assume that you would decide that I want to learn 3 extra hours every night. So I'm going to learn, instead of going to sleep at 11, I'm going to go to sleep at 2 in the morning. I'm going to learn from 11 to 2, beyond the Seder. Wow. So on one level, 3 extra hours, gewaldic, amazing. On the other level, what effect will it have on your davening, your learning the next day, and your general, temper and the like? So who wins at the end? You got in your 3 hours of learning. For a while, you may eventually drop that anyway. And the Yetzer Hara destroyed your davening and your learning during the day. So sometimes the zeal to do a mitzvah is part of the Yetzer Hara to sidetrack you from your avodah. I mentioned this many times already over the years, but this is the Chafetz Chaim's famous word. V'haser satan, we say in Ma'ariv, remove the satan milfanenu, from in front of me, umiacharenu, and from in back of me. So the satan in front of me is I want to go to the Beis Medrash, and he's talking me out of it. He's blocking the door by telling me, do this, do that. I understand the satan in front of me who's blocking me. But who is the satan in back of me? I'm already past him. Says the Chafetz Chaim, that's the satan pushing you into the Beis Medrash. Learn till 2 in the morning because he knows he's going to ruin you that way. That's why the Chafetz Chaim, in fact, would go into the Beis Medrash in Radin at 12 midnight, shut off the lights, and make the Bachrim go to sleep. And I think I mentioned that the Chafetz Chaim learned this lesson himself from a very, very bitter and difficult experience. At some point, I think he was in his teens, he was such a masmid, one can imagine, the Chafetz Chaim, that he became very, very ill. And he says, I'm not sure exactly how literal to take this, that he could not learn Gemara for a whole year. Again, I'm not sure if it's mamish, that literal. But he said he could not learn Gemara for a whole year. And he says he was genuinely in doubt whether he could ever learn again. And b'chastei Hashem, he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu restored his health. But since then, he was hypersensitive to the notion that there is a Yetzer Hara of ruining your health. So that goes back to the idea of chumrah, kula. But in terms of how you know which is which, usually you could tell by the language of the thing. Yeah.
Here's a second. Why do we add names of biblical origin and try to relate them to secular names of babies? For example, I name my baby Scott, so we equate his Hebrew name to Shlomo. Or Gary is Gershon. But while it may be more appropriate to name someone from Kadosh, if someone already has a given name, or there's an available name of a grandfather like Harry or something, why is it considered better to go past that and try to, so to speak, match it in Kadosh, or go better than that in Kadosh? Secondly, why does a convert need to change his name? Thirdly, what happened to all the names in Tanakh that seemingly go unused? For example, in Pinchas, we went through so many names of holy people, yet we don't see names like Zuri Shaddai, Nemuel, Palu, or Shulam, etc.
Yeah. Well, these are ideas you can, keep in mind as family grows. The thing, so the thing is, first of all, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe the concept of matchup of secular and Jewish names is quite literally an American invention. I don't think there's any particular makor that your English name or your secular name has to match up. So you could be called whatever it is, Charlie, and your Hebrew name could be Avram. You don't have to find some thing about Charlie and the like. So I would not give it any particular credence. I don't think it's religiously significant. It was a way in which, people came to the rabbi and said, hey, I named my child George, what's the Hebrew equivalent of George? It was a way of convincing parents to give their kid a Hebrew name, which is called a Shem Kodesh, a holy name. So I wouldn't worry about it. I don't think there's any particular significance to it. The issue of unused names is actually an interesting question. First of all, this is not your question, but just to add to your question, we find even names that were used in the Gemara are no longer used. We had a famous Tana, Rabbi Yishmael, who was a Kohen Gadol. Yishmael, right? All right, so I know Moby Dick begins, call me Ishmael, okay. But if you would call your child Yishmael, people would think you're crazy. What type of person? Now, there is, unfortunately, in modern Israel, Nimrod is a name. I can't believe that's very hard to believe. At least name him Yishmael. You have a makor for that. But the thing is that obviously Yishmael was used as a name based on the Maimer Chazal that Yishmael did teshuva before he died, right? So Yishmael died at tzaddik, and that's why the name was a permissible name. And yet the minhag has become b'dafka not. And some names we don't use because they were Rishonim. Avshalom, although Lamaisa, Avshalom is listed. In the names of Gittin, in Hilchos Gittin, we have dictionaries, the Beis Shmuel, dictionaries of how to spell names, because for a get, exact spellings are very, very important. And you'll find Avshalom is a name, as well as Avi Shalom, which is actually a different name, but those are theirs as well. And then they have Yiddish names that they have to spell for a get, it's extremely important to spell the names correctly. But the issue of why so many names are not used, it's a very good question. I don't really have an answer for it. Because some of the names of people were actually tzadikim. I mean, let me give you one example of this. Just one example at random, but there are many, 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 many examples. David HaMelech had a son from his wife Abigail, whose name was Kilov, not Kalev. Kalev is also not that common, although Kalev ben Yefuna is Vada Yetzadik. Even Kalev is not common. But the name Kilov, that's Chaf Lamed Aleph Beis, is not used at all. And yet, the Gemara describes Kilov as an enormous Talmid Chacham, a tremendous Gadol b'Torah, and a tremendous tzaddik. Why is his name not used? Totally righteous name, right? If anything, Kilov was in less trouble than Shlomo. Shlomo is a name we do use, but Shlomo had a bit of a mixed record. He's a tzaddik, but there was one man d'amar in the Gemara, one man d'amar, that Shlomo doesn't have a chelik in Olam Haba, although we don't paskin that way, and the like. So this is I'll look into it myself. I don't have a good answer. Why some names made it and some names did not make it. And then, of course, you have the problem of all of the strange names in the Gemara of the Amoraim, Ashi and Papa, right? All of these different names, Abaye. Rava is actually Ravaba. Rava is a contraction, so that's a separate thing. So I don't know. It'd be a fascinating attempt to try to understand why some names became more makubal in Klal Yisrael, and other names did not become makubal in Klal Yisrael.
Converts?
Why does a convert change his name? A convert presumably doesn't have a Hebrew name. So what should you do? Let's assume he doesn't have a Hebrew name, so he has to have a Shem Kodesh. Sure. A Jew has to have a Shem Kodesh, so he has to change. He doesn't have to change his secular name, and the like. Now, I just want to say a little thought about Rav Chaim Kanevsky's shita. Rav Chaim Kanevsky, Zichrono Livracha, had a very, very strong, emphatic view about what is a proper name for somebody. Ad kedei kach, that he would tell people if they didn't have the proper name, they should change their name. And one of the names that he was very against was the name Shira. Didn't like Shira. He said Shira's a made-up name, Zionist name, modern Hebrew name, whatever it is, Shira. So when somebody said to him, he named his daughter Shira because she was born Shabbos Shira, meaning when they read Oz Yashir. So he says, So if she's born Parshas Para, you're going to name her Para. Name her a cow. Now, the Maisa, Rachel actually means a lamb, so we actually do name after a lamb, but a cow, that would sound not so good. So Rav Chaim Kanievsky routinely would tell people whose daughters were named Shira, you have to change the name. Or names like Zahava, and others, all kinds of modern names, Zahava, etc. Golda is an old Yiddish name. So Golda, Goldie, that's okay. Zahava, not okay. What's the pshat? Now, Rav Chaim can't mean, some people touch up Rav Chaim, you're only allowed to use names that appear in Tanakh. That can't be what he means because the name Chaim doesn't appear in Tanakh. So obviously he was not saying, as people sometimes say, it has to be a Tanakh name. His name is not in Tanakh. Elamai, it seems to be that the minhagim have been established and you should not deviate from the old minhagim. And when you deviate from the old minhagim, you're taking a step towards reform and the like. You know, there seems to be an anti-reform, anti-Zionist type of thing rather than a requirement of biblical. But for those of you that have sisters or even mothers whose name is Shira, I mean, don't worry about it too much. As great and awesomely great as Rav Chaim was, most Gedolim have not taken that position. So you would be in trouble if he told you to change their daughter's name. You would have been given a direct psak. But if you were not given a direct psak, you're not mechuyev to follow it. Yeah.
How is one to approach when Rashi and Chumash seemingly contradicts himself, sometimes back to back? And I'll give the Rav a simple example in last week's parsha. Rashi says when Moshe Rabbeinu was asking for a leader, Rashi says, Lo dia shivchan shel tzadikim sheniftar min olam menichin tzarkan ve'oskim etzarchi tzibor. They're not going to osik with their tzarkin. The next Rashi, literally Rashi says, Kivan Moshe she'amar lo makom te'nachas lavchalu v'nosav amar hegia shah she'edva tzarki she'yusha bonai eskadu asi. So sometimes you find Rashi literally says the opposite back to back. How is one to approach that?
Yeah, so the back-to-back is a bit of a problem, but there is a klal gadol that you need to know about Rashi, both ala Torah, Anach, and in the Gemara itself, that when there are different midrashim that say opposite things, Rashi will sometimes explain a pasuk according to one medrash, and then, because he wants you to know the medrash, will explain another pasuk, or a little later on, according to the other medrash, simply because it was a way that Rashi got both teachings out there. He does the same thing in Gemara. Sometimes you have a sugya, a question-answer sequence that appears in two Masechtas. And Rashi will sometimes explain it one way in one Masechta, and explain it another way in another Masechta. And even though that is a stira, that is a contradiction, but the Meforshim say, there's a klal in Rashi, that if there were two mahalchim, he wanted the reader to be familiar with these different ways of approaching a sugya. So in Chumash too, Rashi will often bring contradicting midrashim. Now it is a little unusual for Rashi to, unless he brings it a davar acher. In other words, Rashi will sometimes bring contradicting midrashim, but then he'll do it in the form, he'll give you medrash one and then say davar acher, another pshat. But to simply explain this pasuk like this medrash, and the next pasuk like another medrash, without indicating that it's a davar acher, that is indeed unusual. I would actually check the girsa if there would be a davar acher that was left out. Sometimes there may have been a davar acher that was left out. And a good thing to do is always, there are many meforshim on Rashi. Rashi, there are 300 meforshim more on Rashi's commentary on the Chumash. And Sifsei Chachamim is the most popular one. That's typically printed in the Mikros Gedolos. But the most definitive parish on Rashi is the Rabbi Mizrahi. He's called the Mizrahi, nothing to do with Zionism. Rabbi Mizrahi. And what Rabbi Mizrahi does is, he will always go through the sources that Rashi brings. If Rashi brings a medrash, he'll tell you this is from this medrash. He'll quote the whole medrash, and then on the next pasuk he'll quote the other medrash, and then he'll usually ask the question that these midrashim contradict. and he will give you an explanation. So if you look at Rav Eliyahu Mizrahi, you'll usually find a yishuv to those issues. Another thing Rav Mizrahi does is that he is miyashev, because the Ramban asks many kashas on Rashi. So just like the Pnei Yoshua in Gemara answers Tosfos's kashas on Rashi. That's one of the Pnei Yoshua's jobs, so to speak. So Rav Eliyahu Mizrahi will answer the Ramban's kashas on Rashi. Ad kedei kach that the Pri Megadim writes, this little aside, that somebody asked him, like, if I wanted to increase my knowledge of Torah generally, what would be the sefer that would give me the greatest return on my investment? He actually said it was the Perush HaMizrahi on Rashi. Because you learn the Chumash, you get all the Midrashim in full, the halachic discussions, the machlokes Rashi and Ramban, and how Rashi would answer it. He says it's a way that you get many, many yedios in Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh and Torah Shebechsav, based on that limit. Yeah.
How often should a normal person check the psukim in their tefillin, like to make sure they're not puzzle? After how many years? Assuming normal wear and tear. If I'm not going skydiving or something.
Yeah, so it's very interesting that this is a very fascinating example of a halacha in Shulchan Aruch that we're actually, not only do we ignore it, but the poskim say to ignore it based on conditions. Basically, let's say mezuzahs. Mezuzahs are supposed to be checked twice every 7 years, which actually means once every 3.5 years. And tefillin have a similar requirement. But the poskim say that largely does not apply today. That sometimes the old mezuzahs didn't have cases. They were exposed to the elements, and therefore the water could cause damage and everything else. You needed to check it. Today, there are many poskim that say that if the mezuzah is in a case, it's better not to check it at all. Some are machmer, but not check it at all, because the checking itself, the opening itself, may crack a letter. That's a problem, because the ink of Ksav Ashuris is actually riding on top of the cloth. It's not absorbed in the cloth. And therefore, when you fold and unfold, you crack a letter sometimes, which can make it puzzle. Same thing with tefillin. So as a result, the normal recommendation is that unless your tefillin have come in contact with water or have been in unusually hot weather, it's better not to check them. It's better. So the truth is we generally do not specifically check our tefillin. Some people are machmer, they want to check them every 3 years. So you can, but some actually recommend not doing it. But again, if they've come in contact with water, you absolutely have to check them immediately, because water certainly can passel tefillin. Yeah.
Why does it appear from Jewish literature that the tzadikim, who are by definition graced with exceptional abilities, receive a greater degree of Olam Haba than regular people who are not graced with these exceptional abilities? The tzadikim were graced with these exceptional abilities from birth, and at first glance do not do anything. Do tzadikim in fact receive a greater degree of reward because of this gift, or is it more to the story?
Yeah, so the question was, tzadikim who have great gifts, why should they get more Olam Haba because of the great gifts that they were born with? That was not their accomplishment per se. You're 100% right. A tzaddik will not get more Olam Haba because of the gifts they were born with. 100% correct. A tzaddik will get Olam Haba based on what they did with the gifts they were born with. Meaning to say, whatever they were born with is not the basis of Olam Haba for anybody. So, the Vilna Gaon was born a genius. We can make that assumption. He was a genius. He did not go to Olam Haba because he was a genius. He came to Olam Haba because, among many other things, he learned 18 hours a day. Now, nobody made him learn 18 hours a day. This was his bechira, his decision. You get rewarded based on what you struggle with, what you force yourself to do, what you make yourself do beyond your abilities. And the more abilities you have, the more responsibility you have. So yeah, a tzaddik gets Olam Haba because of what they made themselves, not because of what God made them. Now, there is a story. This is fascinating. This is actually a fascinating little example of how what people call midrashim sometimes is totally false. The Tiferes Yisrael, I'm going to digress a little bit, but I think it's connected to your story, to your question. The Tiferes Yisrael was a Rav in Germany, and he wrote one of the great Perushim on Mishnayos, right? You open a Mishnayos, you have the commentary of Tiferes Yisrael. So in Pirkei Avos, he recounts a story from a medrash. And this is the story of the face or the head of Moshe Rabbeinu. And the story goes that when Paro hears that this Moshe has come back to town after so many years in Midjan, and Moshe is doing these miracles, and Moshe is taking the Jews out of Eretz Yisrael. So Paro apparently was a studier of the human skull, right? There was a thing called phrenology. You look at the bumps on somebody's head, and it was a pseudoscience, and you figure out, what his personality is and everything else. I'm not sure how you could tell it from a picture, but whatever it is. He wanted a painting of Moshe so he could study the skull. And he was very, very amazed. He looked at the skull of Moshe, and it was the skull of a base person, a person with taivas, a person with gaivas. And when he met Moshe in person again, it wasn't the same Paro that raised him, he says, how could you do all these miracles? I see from your head that you're a lowly person, baal taiva, baal gaiva. How do you do all these things? So the Medrash says, the Tiferes Yisrael says, that Moshe Rabbeinu says, yes, indeed, I was born with all of those blemishes. I was born with all of those chesronos. But I worked on myself, and I struggled, and I made myself into a righteous and humble person, even though that wasn't my nature. And that is why God chose me, because I had worked on myself. And the Tiferes Yisrael uses this medrash as a very important inspiration to people, that you should never just say, oh, I was born lazy, I was born this and that. We can all change, we can all grow. Beautiful, beautiful medrash. However, it was determined that there was no such medrash at all, that this was recorded in books of the Middle Ages that had different maisim, that were sometimes called midrashim, but the origin was a German folk tale. It was not even a Jewish source. Bichlal. He was making a point, and indeed it's connected many other teachings of Chazal. Chazal described Moshe Rabbeinu as being born, and the whole house filled with light. That Moshe Rabbeinu was saintly and righteous from birth, not that he was a base person who worked on himself. So it's interesting, in the newer editions of Tiferes Yisrael that always fool around with censorship, they took out the story. In the older editions, it's there. Okay, that's a little bit of bibliographical trivia. But the point of the story is still very emes. Whether it applied to Moshe or not, that's another issue. You don't get rewarded for what you were born with. You get rewarded for what you do about it. And we do know that many, many Gedolim were made, that they had to work on certain midos that were not natural to them. Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was, like his namesake Moshe Rabbeinu, the most humble of people, person who never lost his temper for anything. He once told somebody, as a little aside, he says, I wasn't born this way. I was born excitable. I was born, propensity to get angry. But I worked on myself not to have anger. And then it became part of my nature. But I worked on it. It wasn't something that was easy for me. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, the great Rav Chaim Brisker. We know Rav Chaim Brisker as the deepest of thinkers, the deepest analytical, right? The whole derech of the Litvish Yeshivas is based on Rav Chaim. But Rav Chaim, on Rav Chaim's Matseva in Warsaw, he's buried right next to the Nitziv. It doesn't describe him as Ga'ayin HaGa'ayinim or whatever it is. It calls him Ish HaChesed, the man of loving kindness. He took in abandoned babies, whatever it would be. And Rav Chaim said on himself that B'teva, he was not a kind person. B'teva, he didn't always care about people that much. He was preoccupied with his thing. But he knew the Torah wants you to be a kind person. So he worked on himself. to be kind till it became a teva. That's an amazing thing. That's quite an amazing thing, the idea of working on yourself. And so whether the story about Moshe is emes or not, the point is vadai emes. And Rav Chaim, in fact, what is the Olam says, there are two Gedalim that the world underestimates. The Chafetz Chaim and Rav Chaim Brisker, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. People look at the Chafetz Chaim as a tzaddik, and they don't recognize his gaonus, his greatness in learning. And they look at Rav Chaim as a gaon, and they don't recognize his righteousness. And they're both wrong. The Chafetz Chaim was a bigger gaon than he was even a tzaddik, and Rav Chaim was a bigger tzaddik than he was even a gaon. But people focus on those different aspects of him. Yeah.
So when we first start out in Yiddishkeit, be it baal tshuva or even if you're from birth, but when you're younger, when you're first starting out and learning in Yiddishkeit, we put a lot more emphasis on, or we tend to gravitate more towards things that are inspirational ideas about the reality of Hashem and Yiddishkeit, hashkafa, things like that. Then as we we focus on tefillah, we focus on building like a love and a connection and appreciation for Yiddishkeit. And then as we kind of get older and more serious, we start to realize that once we've accepted this as true and the right thing, Hashem wants us to learn Torah. We start getting more into just more serious, just Gemara learning, more medactic and halachos, more into the nitty gritty, if you will.
Yeah.
How do you prevent yourself from losing that love and connection and just almost like appreciation and joy in it when you start getting deeper into just the nitty gritty of just learning Gemara or halachos?
Yeah. This is reminiscent of a bunch of jokes. There's a lot of bunch of jokes along the theme. How do you know when a baal tshuva is well integrated in the frum community? When have you made it? When have you become normalized? When are you part of the kehillah? So all the jokes have the same punchline, more or less. It's, when you bench in 2 minutes, when you talk during davening, when you spend most of Shabbos going to sleep. Baruch Hashem, you've made it. You're no longer the baal tshuva guy that has to be learning all the time or spending a half an hour on Shmona Esrei. And, these are funny jokes, but they're very, very sad jokes, because what they're basically saying is, if I see a guy who's passionate, who's excited, who's filled with love of Hashem, something's funny about him. He's not a normal frum guy. A normal frum guy is supposed to be indifferent. A normal frum guy is not supposed to be so involved and passionate about Yiddishkeit. How could that be? What does that mean? That means what? The more religious I get, the less I'm connected to Hashem? That doesn't make any sense, right? So, you've identified something. In fact, there's a famous speech at Lincoln Square. They were having a dinner for their Kiruv organization. So a guy made a speech, why I hate Baalei Tshuva. It was a very affectionate speech, actually. And he made the point, I come home Friday night, I want to eat for 15 minutes and then go to bed. And I have these Baal Tshuvas over, and they want to have a vort on the Parsha, and they have to sing all the Zemiros that are in the Siddur. He says, I don't want that. Okay? He was making the point that people are so inspired. So the question becomes, come on, that can't be what Hashem wants. That can't be the intention of any of this. So the question is, how do I hold on? How do I remain, so to speak, a Baal Tshuva in the good way of being a Baal Tshuva, while I progress in the normal acclimation process of becoming part of the religious community? It's a very, very excellent question. I think you're 100% correct in identifying this has to be a derech that we go. Now, one of the ways actually is to teach it to somebody else who's below you, meaning to say, often by, and again, anyone in our Somayach can do this, even someone who's been in Mechina for a year can do some teaching to somebody who's just came to Mechina, or whatever it would be. Everybody has something to give. And sometimes when you get to see the Torah through the eyes of the newcomer, you get a sense of renewal and the like. The other thing is, you have to ask yourself, what is it in my prior experiences that inspired me? What is it that turned me on? And then you try to replicate it. If, for example, it was singing, then you continue, find a venue to sing. If it was Hasidus, find a way to be Mamshech Hasidus. Meaning, in addition to your Gemara, in addition to your halacha, in addition to the things that you have to do as you progress in learning, try to recapture the things that moved you emotionally. It shouldn't be like a growing up experience. Oh, I don't do that anymore. I'm grown up. No, hold on to those things that give you chizuk and continue to seek them out. In Yerushalayim, Baruch Hashem, there are many different opportunities to try to recapture some of that Islavos. And you're correct. You're correct. We all have to look for sources that inspire us. Listen, there's no secret. When I was in yeshiva many years ago, in a mainstream, I was in Arizona in Baltimore, in a mainstream, what you call Litvish yeshiva, there were no Hasidic Sfarim around. There was no Sfas Emes. There was no Rav Tzadok. There was one guy, Rav Lansky, who's still, Baruch Hashem, still teaching. He was our official mystic in there. Nershel had one mystic, so to speak. But, nobody else was doing that. Nesiva Shalom wasn't even written yet. And yet now, if you go to any yeshiva, or Somayach, or you go to Mir, go to Chevron, go to Panovich, you will see a Tanya, you will see Rav Tzadok, you will see Nesiva Shalom, you will see Sfas Emes, all over the place, all over the place. In other words, Hasidus has permeated, I think, the Litvish yeshiva world. Why is that so? Why? Why are so many people who are not Hasidic people? They're not from Hasidic families. Why do they gravitate towards Sifrei Hasidus? Because people need inspiration. People need inspiration. Now, ideally, you can learn a blot of Gemara, and that should inspire you. And maybe that's the way it was in Slobodka and Mir. Today, maybe we're not on the Madrega. We need like supplementary jolts of spiritual energy to excite us and to elevate us. Maybe that's a chisaret. But once again, if that's what we need to follow it. I know in Yeshiva University, in YU, they have this thing they call Neo-Hasidim, meaning YU officially was a Brisker institution. Again, American Brisk, different than Israeli Brisk, an American Brisker institution. But now they had Moshe Weinberger, they have people who are like Hasidic teachers and the like. So some of the older Briskers, they think this is a betrayal. Brisk is not Hasidic. But Lamaisa, people need it. People need it. So you have to hold on to the good part, right? You're not repudiating where you came from. You're just taking it and then adding more things to enrich it, but you still hold on to the things that give you inspiration. Yeah.
So there was a crazy video I saw last week of some Israeli lady yelling at the Lubavitcher who was wrapping tefillin on people. I don't know if you saw the video.
I did not know.
Okay.
So a Chabad guy was putting on tefillin on somebody?
Tefillin on some kids, and this
So the lady yelled?
Yeah, she yelled at him, says it's against the law. Not true,
Yes,
not true.
well,
But,
yeah, okay.
had me thinking, I guess. I remember I started putting on tefillin many months earlier than I would have otherwise if it wasn't for the Chabad Shliach encouraging me to put it on. And I know that's like Chabad's big thing, at least publicly, to wrap tefillin on anyone who's walking on the street, basically.
Yeah, as long as,
So
yeah.
I was wondering
yeah.
if you could steel man the argument for and against wrapping tefillin.
Yeah. I'll give you the argument. In fact, it's very interesting that Rav Shach, Zechreino Livracha, had a little bit of a war against Chabad his last years. Again, it's hard for us to understand because Rav Shach was one of the Gedolei Hador, maybe the Gadol Hador, and the Rabbi Rebbe was, at least I consider also to be a Gadol. So a machlokas among these two Gedolim, very hard for us to take sides. Rav Shach took the following position. He said that a mitzvah does not count as a mitzvah if a person doesn't believe in Hashem, giving it as a mitzvah. So Rav Shach's argument is to take a guy who doesn't believe in Torah min hashamayim. He doesn't believe God gave the Torah. He doesn't believe that God, either he doesn't believe there's a God or he doesn't believe that whatever God there is commanded us to put on tefillin. But he's doing it because the shaliach is pushing him, or he's doing it because he remembers his grandfather did it, so this way he's like connecting to Zaidi, or whatever it is. So Rav Shach Tainus, it's not a mitzvah, because he's not doing it as a commandment of God, because he doesn't believe in God or doesn't believe that God gave the mitzvah. And therefore, if Shach took the position, it was a bracha levatala, it was a blessing in vain. That was Rav Shach's position. The Rebbe's position, and again, I can't speak for the Rebbe fully, but as I understand the Rebbe's position was that even if a Jew does not consciously believe, in his heart he does believe. That emunah is mushrash, rooted in his neshama. And I think the argument is, it's not worse than chinuch. And if you have a child below bar mitzvah, the kid below bar mitzvah is also not doing a mitzvah. But we're training him so he will eventually do the mitzvah. So why can't that be applied to an adult as well? Yeah, right now you don't believe in God. Maybe it's not a mitzvah yet. But this is training. This is a process. And the Rebbe felt, for very good reason, because I will confirm this from my own personal experiences, tefillin itself is a uniquely powerful, almost like mantra-like mitzvah. Because again, tefillin is the mysterious black box, right? Literally the black box, which has the nuclear code, the Shema, and all those things. And you put it on your arm, which is your strength, and you put it next to your heart, which is your emotion, and you put it on your head, which is your mind. So what are you doing? You're binding, you're tying your strength and your emotion and your mind to the service of God. And even if you're not davening Shachris, right? A guy might say, I'm not ready to daven 45 minutes a day. Okay, but putting on tefillin is a separate mitzvah. Put it on, take it off, 2 minutes, and the like. So I myself have often advised people. People will tell me that they're not religious, they don't keep Shabbos fully. But I say, put on tefillin. Put on tefillin, take it off. Put on tefillin, say Shema Yisrael, one pasuk, not even the whole thing. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Take off the tefillin. And people have described to me that they felt, I don't know if that was your experience, but they felt transformed. They felt that gave a certain direction to their day. So this is the machlokas. Rav Shach, again, had a technical argument that many of the people who put on tefillin are not ma'aminim, and as a result, it's not a mitzvah, it's a bracha levatala. The Rebbe held, number one, there is that emunah that often comes out under stress. And number two, he felt it's not worse than chinuch, because it is a way of preparing them to eventually do mitzvahs. Yeah.
On the topic of tefillin, if someone is, roughly secular Jew, but has a pair of tefillin, maybe from bar mitzvah or something else, but it's most likely not kosher, would you recommend putting on, especially, looking at my journey, it would have been 5 years of rapping every day with the bracha v'tala, and then maybe looking to fix it after 5 years of religiosity. That's 5 years of bracha v'tala, but maybe it's part of their growth. What would the Rav say for a situation like that?
That's a difficult question. I mean, if I had any type of influence over the person, I would try to get the tefillin checked right away, because unfortunately, I have to say that mezuzos and tefillin that were bought in the general market, particularly if they were the cheaper end of things, have an enormous rate of being puzzle. Really an awful thing. Mezuzos sometimes just had Xeroxed parshios, which are legamri puzzle, and tefillin as well. And even if they're kosher, so you understand why tefillin is a delicate issue. Even mezuzos, because the cheaper tefillin tends to be smaller. And when they're smaller, it's much more difficult to write kosher small parshios than to write kosher big parshios. Because when the letters are close together, remember, if a letter touches another letter, right? 2 letters, right? The whole thing is puzzle. So it's very hard. You're writing. It's very, very hard for a sofer to write a kosher tefillin or mezuzah when it's small. So the small tefillin is almost always puzzle. Although there's a new type of small, well, it's not so new, but it's been around 15 years. Call it the Abe Lincoln tefillin. This is the stovepipe hat, because tefillin have to be square, but they don't have to be cubed. In other words, tefillin can actually be square. The base is equal length and width, but it can be tall. You can have tefillin that are like a chimney. And those tefillin are actually the best of both worlds, because the problem is There's a problem with small tefillin and there's a problem with big tefillin. The problem with small tefillin is the parshios are probably going to be puzzle. The problem with big tefillin, particularly when you have a small bar mitzvah kid, is that the tefillin is bigger than his head area and bigger than his bicep area. So the tefillin will hang down, 2/3 of his arm. So small tefillin are easier to position in the right place. So the Abe Lincoln stovepipe hat tefillin actually solve both problems because you have a small, narrow base, but because you have height, that gives you room to put in bigger parshias. So it looks funny because it's not the tzura of tefillin that we're used to, but actually halachically, it may be the best type of tefillin to get. Yeah.
Here's another sentence. If you are someone that either knows or can learn halacha independently in order to know what to do 99% of the time for halachos of daily life, once you are married and out of yeshiva or kollel, what should your relationship with your Rav look like?
Yeah, so the question becomes, if you're a person who basically can look up Mishnah Brura and can understand basic halacha, so what is your relationship with your Rav? So you're right, 100%. Your relationship with your Rav will be a little different. You still need a Rav, aseh lecha Rav, but it won't be a Rav that I call up for, milchik and fleishik problems, because, you should be able to figure those out. But there's going to be personal issues in your life. There's going to be issues of how I should raise my children. There may be shalom bayis issues. There may be all sorts of personal issues. So I would say that the relationship with the Rav will change from focusing on specific halachic issues to matters of hashkafa, outlook, right? Matters of shalom bayis, matters of community. In fact, it's very interesting. There's a very chashuv Rav in Kiryat Sefer. He's a big posek, Rav Moshe Mordechai Karp. Some of you might have heard of him. He's a chashuv Talmud Chacham. And he was very close to Rabbi Yashiv. So this is an interesting story. So he paskined something. So somebody said to him, Rabbi Yashiv said the opposite. How can you paskin that way? So he said, well, I only asked Rabbi Yashiv things I couldn't figure out myself. Things I figured out myself, I never asked him. So if I paskin differently, I paskin differently. It's pretty amazing. He said that, I didn't go to Rabbi Yashiv for every single shaila I had. I tried to determine the halacha. When there were things I couldn't figure out, I went to Rabbi Yashiv. I even heard this, and I couldn't believe this story, but it's in the biography, wonderful biography. I think I mentioned before, if you haven't read the Art Scroll biography of Rav David Feinstein, Rav Moshe's son, read it. It's wonderful. By the way, you don't have to get me a copy. 2 people have gotten me whatever. When I mention the biography, I'm not asking for anyone to get me the book, but it's a fantastic book. And in the book, people talk about Rav David Feinstein as a paisik. And people would ask him a shaila, he would paskin, and they would say, but your father in Igros Moshe said the opposite. So he says, it's hard for me to believe, he says, you're asking me or asking my father? What do you want? Now, Rav David's covet for his father was enormous. And afilu hachi, he held that he had an achrayas to paskin the way he saw it. He didn't always follow his father. So your relationship to the Rav is going to be a different relationship. And again, it's very similar in some ways to what's your relationship with your parents. Right? When you're a kid, your relationship to your parent is a certain way. When you're an adult, hopefully you'll still have a wonderful, close relationship with your parents. But it's different. There's a maturation that goes on. And I've said before that if a yeshiva does not prepare you to be an independent person, the yeshiva has not done its job. The yeshiva is not there to foster the equivalence of an umbilical cord, where you never think, you never figure out things. You're supposed to be able to think things out based on the Torah learning that you have, but you still need a Rebbe as a kind of someone that you connect when you're confused or uncertain about things. Yeah.
Here's another sentence. Can a girl have a bar mitzvah? Why or why not? If not, can she have a bat mitzvah? Why or why not?
Well, one thing I can answer very certainly. A girl cannot have a bar mitzvah, because bar mitzvah by definition is for males. I will not make a joke about transgenders and different uncertainties. But generally, forgive me, but generally, bar mitzvah is not for girls by definition. Now, what about bas mitzvah? So again, it's very, very interesting. I'm sure you know that in the United States, many, many, many Orthodox synagogues, primarily what we would call modern Orthodox synagogues, but some of them are still very frum, do have bas mitzvah celebrations of different ways. And again, Rav Ovadia Yosef actually has a tshuva that he says that the same way a bar mitzvah is a sudas mitzvah, you're celebrating a boy becoming obligated in the mitzvos. Rav Ovadia paskin. Rav Ovadia was not modern Orthodox. Rav Ovadia paskins. Now, of course, he's Sephardi, but he was not basing it on unique Sephardic aspects. This was a general pshat that a bas mitzvah is a suudas mitzvah, and you have to observe tznius, of course, etc. But within the laws of tznius, it is proper to celebrate it because it is the simcha of being obligated to keep Hashem, the opportunity to keep Hashem's mitzvahs. Now, different posts can talk about this, but the outstanding cholek on Rav Ovadia was Rav Moshe Feinstein, who wrote earlier than Rav Ovadia. Rav Moshe Feinstein actually took the position that a bas mitzvah is not a sudas mitzvah. Why not? That's a good kasha, because if a bar mitzvah is a sudas mitzvah, because you're celebrating chiyuv b'mitzvahs, then why wouldn't the identical logic apply to a bas mitzvah? Rav Moshe seems to say that because of inyanim of tznius, it never became makubal in Klal Yisrael to make a thing. And because of this, Rav Moshe was against making a bas mitzvah in a beis knesset. But he did say that even Rav Moshe says the family is allowed. He wasn't so enthusiastic, I have to admit. The family is allowed to make a party for their daughter. Rav Ovadia was much more enthusiastic. Rav Ovadia considered it to be a sudas mitzvah that you can make in a beis knesset. And it can be public, although he probably, I don't remember all the tshuva, he probably would not be in favor of the girls speaking to a mixed group. I think that much would probably be the case, but you can still make a kiddush, a seuda, and a celebration. Now, I would suggest, just as a matter of practicality, being a rabbi for 25 years in a congregation, that in most Orthodox congregations in the United States, Lav Dafka Israel, a bas mitzvah is probably a very good thing to have, because I've seen is that when people make a big deal about the boys and they don't do anything for the girl often feels that her Yiddishkeit is not that important, and whether she keeps mitzvahs is not that important. And it's very, very important that we build up Torah and mitzvos and give people chizuk that they're doing something significant. And a bas mitzvah can be a mechanism that gives a girl a sense that being a bas Yisrael is an important thing. So you may not need it in every type of kehillah. Certainly Hasidim do not make a bas mitzvah 100%. But at least where, if it's not an ultra Haredi or ultra Hasidic group, a bas mitzvah of some sort, it can take different forms, is probably a very good idea to do. So I would encourage it.
Should Jews avoid buying or associating with German products or brands in general, and specifically ones that were like associated with the Holocaust or Nazi Party?
Right. So the question is, should Jews boycott German products generally, or even if they don't boycott German products generally, what about companies that were associated with killing Jews in the Holocaust, which are still around? Should we boycott? So, I'm not sure how it is now, but you know that virtually all of the Egged buses and virtually all of the cabs in Israel are Mercedes-Benz, which was a German company that was around in the Holocaust, that was involved in the Holocaust. And part of why Israel has it is because Israel got it cheap. This is part of the reparations. Germany, after the war, engaged in a reparation program, and the state of Israel benefited to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds, I don't know how much exactly. Now, at the very time that was announced, there were many, many people that said the state of Israel should not take any money from Germany. That's blood money. That's kind of letting them off the hook for the atrocities of the Holocaust. How can you possibly take money from the people who murdered your mother and your brother and your sister and your father. So this was a very, very big issue. At the end, money won, and there were so many benefits that they made available that Israel took advantage of it. It's still a very controversial area to this very day, more than 70 years after the Holocaust. But here is two things I want to just mention. Point number one is that Rashi brings a chazal that raises a contradiction. In the Ten Commandments it says, Hashem visits the sin of the fathers onto the children. Poked avon avos al banim. In other words, children get punished for the sins of the fathers. But then it says in Parshas Shoftim, lo yumsu avos al banim. Parents should not be killed for the sin of the children. Ubanim lo yumsu al avos. And children should not be punished for the sins of their fathers. Ish becheto yumas. A person should be punished only for his own sins. So that's a contradiction to poked avon avos al banim. Thank you. So Rashi brings an answer from Chazal that say it depends how the children deal with the sins of their ancestors. If they follow the sins of their ancestors, if they endorse them, if they validate them, even if they didn't perpetrate them, God holds them co-conspirators, post-mortem co-conspirators. So a neo-Nazi who says, yeah, my grandfather was right in beating up Jews, God considers him a perpetrator of the Holocaust. But if he repudiates and rejects, so at that point we don't consider him liable for that. Now, I understand the big question is, well, why do I assume that a German or whatever it is has genuine remorse? Maybe they're doing it for money, they're doing it for commercial reasons. Who says what they really feel? Okay, in some cases that's true. In other cases there is genuine regret, contrition. And that would mean that they're not ochsin masa v'seim b'yadeim, and therefore lo yumsu avay salbanim, and there is room for forgiveness. The other point I want to make, though, is this. If you're going to take a boycott position, then why are you stopping at Germany? Now, it's true that the Nazis were the architects of the final solution, but they were not the ones who carried it out. You have the Poles, and you have the Ukrainians. In fact, it's even relevant to supporting Ukraine against Russia right now. And you have the Hungarians. And they were vicious. They were absolutely vicious. They killed and tortured Jews with a geschmack, with a passion, and the like. In fact, this comes up a lot now. All the seminaries and a lot of yeshivas, I think Derech even had a trip, take trips to Poland. I once took a trip to Poland myself. They go to Poland for a few reasons. Number one, to see the grave sites of the Gedolim, the Tziv, Rav Chaim, Rabbi Kiva, great things. To participate in the shul, the Ramaz shul, and to visit the concentration camps, to be misbainain over the tsaras. Right? Going to Poland is a very popular thing now. It's March of the Living. I mean, even non-religious Jewish schools do it. So they do what they do. But yeshivas do it, and seminaries do it for sure. And I said, hey, Derech took a trip. So people are saying, well, what's going on here? The Poles were the most vicious killers of Jews. We are pumping millions of dollars into the Polish economy. We are paying those whose ancestors murdered. So some are absolutely against the Polish trip. And you go there and you see plenty of Israelis. Others say, this cheshbon, it's a new generation. Is there such a thing as teshuva? I will tell you this, one thing about Poland that's so fascinating, though. Anti-Semitism in Poland is very, very deep, very deep. In fact, Polish anti-Semitism is much deeper than German anti-Semitism. And when a Pole sees, I'm going to generalize, I'm not going to say it's true in every case. When they see a Jew, there's a certain fear in their eyes. that you're going to take away their house or whatever it is, because they know that the house belonged to your grandfather or whatever it is. And they're actually afraid that you're coming back to take their things, which they, of course, took from you or took from your ancestor. And you can actually see the fear sometimes that when the Poles encounter Jews, they're not that comfortable with it and the like. So all I can say, I hear both sides of the argument, but I would go with, but as I say, I'm not sure you can limit yourself to Germans at this point. So at that point, the whole European Union is tainted with anti-Semitism. And that may even include the United Kingdom, where whatever it is, Edward, who was the king who abdicated, was making treaties with Hitler to kind of take over the monarchy again. So, ein bias asher ein sham meis. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how much do our decisions that we make actually affect the world and our lives as a whole versus God's overall plan? And obviously, we have examples. With Paro, that God affected his heart. He hardened his heart. So, does God sometimes steer a person towards a certain decision in order to achieve the necessary outcome for his life and maybe or the world as a whole?
Yeah, so that's, again, a very excellent question. To what degree? On one hand, we have free will, that God gives human beings the power to make their own decisions. God normally does not make you be righteous. He does not make you be evil. It's you who make the decision. On the other hand, God has a plan. God has an agenda. God wants the world to move towards a certain place. And the question is, that could only work if God is making you or whoever make certain decisions. So there is a view, and this has a lot of strong support, but it's difficult to fully make sense of, that kings and political leaders are in a different state than everybody else. Meaning you and me, we operate under free will. I can decide to punch you or I can decide not to punch you. Meaning that's free will. God does not make me do that. But when you're dealing with a king, I mean the real king, not like the modern monarch that has no power, but a king or a president who can make decisions that affect large numbers of people. So some say God will sometimes take away their free will in order to advance his particular agenda. God hardening Paro's heart, according to that, would be an example of that phenomenon. So sometimes God will direct political leaders in certain directions, which they may not have done on their own in order to advance the divine agenda. Now, there are two quickie, I'll just mention two questions on that. I think there are a million questions on that, but I'll mention two questions. First of all, just in terms of technical, that is not the explanation the Rambam, I mean, the question of God hardening Paro's heart, and how do you reconcile that with free will? And the answer that, well, when it comes to political leaders, there's no free will. That is not the answer the Rambam gives. The Rambam gives a different answer, and that is, when a person commits sins over and over and over again, anybody, God takes away their free will as punishment for the sins they committed. And that's why it says God hardened Paro's heart after the first 5 plagues, because Paro repeatedly hardened his own heart. So the Rambam himself I believe, does not articulate this idea that political leaders don't have free will. But there is such an approach. The second kasha I have is that I forgot my second question. Okay. I don't know. Okay, it's getting late. Well, I had two questions. One was the Rambam. Never happens to me this. Okay, I'm going to have to remember what I had two problems with free will. If I remember it, I'll mention it before we break. Yeah.
So the question I have is first an aside. You talked about Poland. I know that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I think they waited.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. My second question is, I apologize. Yeah, you're right. Probably so. I'll acknowledge that. My second question is, why does it make a difference who you vote for? Right? We say you should vote for this person, not this person. The kasha is, if God takes over the political leader and the decisions that are going to be made are based on the Ratzon Hashem and are not functions of Bechira, then why should elections make any difference at all? L'chara, it'll happen anyway. Again, there are answers to this, but I'm just throwing out things to think about. Okay, sorry, back to you.
No, wonderful. So I was just, the quick side was that they waited until after the Rebbe passed away to send shluchim to Poland. So it was his position of Chabad that they not send anybody to Poland.
Is that true?
That's
I did not know that. I really did not know that.
Yeah.
There was no Chabad in Poland until after the Rebbe passed away.
That was what I was told.
See, it's interesting to me. If the Rebbe was against it, though, how could they do it after he passed away? I mean, they're violating his directive. Okay.
So
Yeah.
this question kind of ties together a few different things that have been said. We talked about having Hasidish Sfarim in Lippish places. We talked about kind of the Yetzer Hara from kind of behind pushing you into different kinds of things, and the passion that we have as both Yeshivas, and trying to understand as well, as you said, different kind of learning. You said in the past, learn what you like. For those of us who have kind of that different learning approach and want to be able to take on a diverse set of learning as opposed to the best way to learn is, is it kind of a Gemara approach? Once you really, really do that, you'll be able to kind of spread out on your own? Or is it good to have kind of a balanced diet approach, again, of something while you're in yeshiva, because that yeshiva experience you said is designed to help us to leave, and is it better to get a diverse experience while we're in yeshiva versus...
So let me just explain the fundamental issue. Gemara, if I could use maybe a little irreverent expression, is like the 2-ton elephant in the room, meaning Gemara crowds out everything else. But the problem is, Gemara is an extremely labor-intensive limud. It takes a long time to get the skill. It takes a long time to get the vocabulary. It takes a long time for most people to really get the logic of it. And you can really only do it well if you're committed full time. Meaning it's very, very hard to get proficiency in Gemara while you're working or whatever it is. So here's the thing. If you were to tell me, I'm signing a contract with our Somayach, I'm going to be here for the next 25 years. Then I would say, yeah, mix and match. So do Gemara 2 hours a day, and over 25 years, you're going to get there. But most people are not going to sign that contract. Most people are here a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So as a result, this is going to be the last time you will have a full-time ability to get into Gemara. So the point is, I'm being very practical here. The other stuff is very important and very beautiful, but you can do a lot of that on your own. Gemara, you're not going to be able to do on your own. So it's kind of a state of emergency that we got to overload you with Gemara because you need full-time immersion for Gemara, and this is the only chance you have for full-time immersion. Again, as I say, if you were to give me 20 years, I could do less Gemara because over time, you'll get there. But you're not going to give me 20 years, right? So we got to do it this way. So I don't mean to say it should be 100% Gemara. No, I mean, it's good to diversify. I'm not suggesting not to diversify. But I think there is just a pragmatic, I'm not even going into philosophical reasons. There is a pragmatic reason why we have to emphasize Gemara so much, simply because it is the most labor, maybe short of Zohar, but it's the most labor-intensive limud that we have. You need the most time to master it, and you need a full-time environment to master it. So we got to push. In fact, that even explains, on a more basic level, why don't we go with Pirkei Avos' curriculum? Pirkei Avos says 5 years of Chumash, 5 years of Mishnah, and don't do Gemara till you've been learning for 10 years. Once again, if you would give us 25 years, I would say, yeah, the first 5 years we're just doing Chumash or Tanakh. But if you're only going to be here 2 years, everything has to be a state of emergency. So I'm willing to say the whole yeshiva curriculum is I don't want to get in trouble, is a b'di'evet. It's not the right way to do things. But we have to work with suboptimal conditions and do what we can, right? So it's kind of the best we can do with the limitations that we have.
I worry that if somebody, for me, again, I'm very involved with Chabad and also very steeped in the Liffish Yeshiva Ashkenaz world, that if I don't feed kind of the Hasidic aspect of who I am in terms of my blend of hashkafa and the communities that I hope to involve myself with, that I'm kind of not depriving, but I'm not feeding it, energizing, engaging.
No, 100%. Again, I'm not. God forbid, I'm not suggesting at all that you don't bring in Hasidus, even when you're in yeshiva. I'm just defending the predominance of Gemara, not the exclusivity of Gemara, but the predominance. Like people say, well, why do you have to spend so many hours? So I'm answering, because it takes so many hours. But sure, as I said before, we need inspiration, we need chizuk, we need to feed our soul and not just our mind. So sure, by all means, be Isaac in Hasidus. I'm just defending pragmatically why we spend so many hours on Gemara. But sure, do the other stuff too. Yeah.
And just kind of building on this, not only in learning, but also in all other areas that once we establish, okay, a person should spend some time learning some of the other things that he needs to, that inspire him, and a person, and besides for just learning, there are other things a person has to, should take time for, like, do chesed, engage with other people and be, good to other people, don't just closet yourself necessarily. If you have special talents that Hashem gave you, that unique talents that you could use to give to other people, don't ignore them, don't lose them. There are many things in life and other limudim besides Gemara, so knowing that we have to balance all of this, and knowing that, if a person has a shiva, the master shas, the master paiskim, that really takes the crux of time. So how can a person figure out how to really ration all his time between all these things, limudim and other mitzvahs and things that maybe he should engage in other than limudim?
Listen, I wish I knew the answer for myself. I mean, it's a very, very difficult question. And I think, mashali bo chafetz, you gravitate to where your heart pulls you. But before you can move to that modality, you need to have a pretty good exposure of the basic areas of Torah. You can't make a decision of focusing on this and not that until you've seen the this and the that. So when you have a good foundation in Gemara, and a good foundation in Chumash, and a good foundation in halacha, and a good foundation in Musar and Chasidus, then you can devote your life to focusing on what is most meaningful for you. But plus the other activities, but you can't make that decision till you see everything, right? Or not everything, but at least a diversity of different things. So you need to be a generalist before you can specialize, like anything else, right? You have to take general medicine and before you become a specialist or whatever it is. So in Torah, it's the same thing. Yeah.
What would the Rav recommend we do if we have friends or family that they don't see the beauty of Judaism and maybe they even mock it?
Well, it's very, very hard. I mean, the first thing I would say is try not to get involved in discussions, because these type of discussions, unless they're done without insult, tend to not get anywhere, because they just want to be mezalzel. So, you don't have to defend things and the like. But I will say this, one thing that impresses people enormously is good midos. And that is, if they see that even when they say negative things, you don't get angry, you don't get upset, you may say something like, gee, I'm sorry you feel that way. I think I've had positive experiences, but everybody's different. And they see that you're not responding in kind. That causes them to think. That causes them to think about, hey, what is there about this Judaism that the guy doesn't like to fight anymore? So midos is very important. Kindness is very important. Consideration is very important. People have images of religious Jews as being rude, as being pushy, as not caring, as being inconsiderate. Litzarenu, sometimes those pictures are justified. Sometimes. So if you can create a counter-narrative, another way of looking at it, that could change their views very, very quickly, surprisingly quickly. So I think your job is not to argue. Your job is to model. And in that model, there's automatically a bit of a refutation to their argument. Okay? Last question, yeah.
So kind of just building off of that, if
Yep.
you have friends or family, from your life, who maybe aren't where you are with religion, and maybe aren't at the point of growth you're at, the best influence to hang around possibly, and yet these are people who you have a close history with, you have extremely close ties to, they've been a big part of your life. You don't want to just cut them out of your life. How do you deal with that? And the second part of that question would be, and what if would that change? And what would we say if maybe they're even good, not necessarily it?
I don't advocate when you become frum that you have to burn your bridges. I think that certainly family members, even if they're not religious, you bedafka should try to have a loving, good relationship with them. Even non-Jews, it depends exactly, you don't go to their Christmas parties or whatever it is, but within proper boundaries, you can spend some time with them. Yiddishkeit should build bridges. It shouldn't be creating barriers. Now, sometimes you have to distance yourself from negative people, negative influences. But if somebody is a good moral person, someone is a good person, then you can have a shaychus with them. You can have a connection with them. And I gave you the example about the Protestant professor, about Tisha B'Av, the good person, That would be somebody you could be a friend with, and the like. I remember, I've told the story before again, I knew a fellow who grew up as a total secular Jew, and he came to Eretz Yisrael, and not only did he become a baal tshuva, he became a ger chassid, very unusual, because ger is not involved in outreach per se. And he wore a spudik and payas, and that's amazing. And then he got married to a woman who went through the same process. Like, these are the only two people in the world, who went through this process. And I was invited to the chasna in Mea Shora. And I remember I was not that comfortable. I had a black hat, but it wasn't my place. But if I was not so comfortable, his parents were there. It was like the Twilight Zone. Just unbelievable. I remember the father, who was a professor, a very intelligent man. His mouth was agape. He just didn't know what on earth is going on here. He's wandering through, just looking, and he sees his son. He hadn't seen his son for a while. The son is wearing payas. What's going on? He had left Northern Virginia as a regular guy, and what is this? So at the end of the wedding, by the way, the men and the women were not only mechitza, they were different buildings. They were different buildings. But at the end of the chasana, so the kala kind of joined the chasan for Sheva brachas. And the chasan gave a little drasha in Yiddish. He actually knew Yiddish. It was pretty amazing. But then he spoke in English to his parents. And he said, Mom and Dad, I know that I'm living a life that's very different than your life. But I want you to know that 90% of what I am is because of you. And the 10% that's different is because you gave me the independence and strength to go on my own journey. Now, this was a very beautiful point, because this was saying that his teshuva was not rejecting his parents. These are things he got from his parents: intellectual, inquisitive, curiosity and the like. And I remember I was sitting next to a Hasidic guy who didn't seem to know English, but he was nodding away like as if he had, great word. Now, maybe he was an American too, who went through some disguise. But I think even the people who didn't know English knew that this was, as Chazal say, Devarim hayotzim min halev, things that come from the heart, nichnasim el halev, they go into the heart. So, everybody got a lot, whether your parents were religious, not religious. Assuming Bezras Hashem they were not, God forbid, abusive or whatever. You got a lot. You got a lot from your family. There may be difficulties and the like. And people that you love and you care about, you should still love and care about. And Judaism shouldn't be, a source of rejecting them and rejecting friends who meant a lot to your life. Now, it is sad. I'm going to admit that, obviously, people move in different directions. Sometimes friendships, people do move in different directions. So it's not always going to be the same, but you can keep something that was meaningful to you can still be meaningful. So you got to balance it. You just got to be sure that you're not compromising your belief system in the interest of friendship. So sometimes you have to make decisions. But often you don't have to make decisions, meaning not everything is an either-or type of situation. And when it's not an either-or type of situation, then you try to have both, try to maintain both. You know, I just read the Shvidei Eish, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, was a gadol. But he was a little bit of an unusual gadol. He had a university education, etc. And his best friend, his closest friend, was a Reform rabbi who happened to be a big, I don't know if I can use the word Talmud Chacham, but a very learned, very, very learned person. And the Shvidei Eish felt he was able to confide in this person things that he could never talk about with anybody else. Of course, what they did was they published the letter. They probably shouldn't have done this. I mean, somebody published the private letters they exchanged. So, Shaila, are you allowed to read? I have to admit that I'm nichshol and I read them. But I think there's at least a Shaila. Are you allowed to read private correspondence? Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom, people don't realize, Rabbeinu Gershom made a cherem against divorcing a woman against her will. He made a cherem against polygamy for Ashkenazim. The third thing he said was a cherem against reading mail, reading other people's mail. The question is, does that cherem apply once it's published? It could be the guy who publishes it might be over on the cherem, but I'm not reading mail. I'm reading an article in a magazine, right? So that's a technicality, I think. I'm not sure if that comports with the spirit of the cherem Rabbeinu Gershom. But the reason I'm bringing this in is just to make the point that even people who were very, very different on a religious scale still had a certain bond of friendship that they shared. Okay, thank you very much. Be well. Good Shabbos.